I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the OMNI Viewer, and I know I'm not reviewing something that's brand new, but I still just finished this and feel like I should talk about it in some capacity. You see, I mostly do Godzilla stuff on this channel. As you can tell from my backdrop, Godzilla and Kaiju are my main focus. But being the Omni Viewer, I have a lot of different interests, and I like to branch out and look at other things as well. I bring that up because there is a Godzilla-related series coming to Apple TV. And I've been hesitant to subscribe to Apple TV as a streaming service, and I didn't necessarily want to do it for just one series that might not even last a whole season. Because, I originally subscribed to HBO Max because it looked like that would be the only way to watch Godzilla vs. Kong. But then I thought, after a while, I just wasn't really using it that much. And anything from Warner Brothers or HBO that I did want to see, I already have on DVD. So why keep it around? But with Apple TV, I know there's an expectation that I'll be checking out the Godzilla series. So I wanted to look and see if there was anything else that might be worth checking out. Anything that might keep me there, at least for a little bit longer. And one thing that I knew was there that I'd always wanted to, well, maybe not always wanted to check out, but I was certainly curious about, was the adaptation of Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. And the reason I was particularly interested in that is because I have a personal connection with Foundation. You see, when I was younger, my parents read a lot to me, like for bedtime stories and stuff. I was actually, I don't mean to brag, but I had a pretty advanced reading level for my age. And my parents knew this, and so they wouldn't just read me simple bedtime stories, or not even just bedtime stories, just reading along with me on weekends or for other things. They encouraged me to read more complex things than my peers were, and they would read to me things that were more complex. At one point, my dad decided he would read me Asimov's Foundation trilogy, and the books that followed the trilogy. He read me the whole series, basically. And yes, even at a young age, I understood it and I was not bored. In fact, because I started getting curious about the adaptation, I decided to also read it for myself for the first time, because it had been a very long time, in the original edition that my dad read it to me. This is like a classic version right here. I think it was printed when? This collection of the first 3 books was printed in 1982. I'm not very far just yet because I only just started, but I'm far enough that I think I have a pretty good idea of how accurate the adaptation for Apple TV would be. So I decided to take advantage of a free trial and check out the first season. And I gotta tell ya, I'm impressed. The series is not perfect, but the flaws are minimal, in my opinion, compared to the things it gets right, at least at this point. Now, the one thing I was worried about with this adaptation, and I think a lot of Asimov fans were worried about it as well, was the idea that it might get spiced up a little by adding more action to it, because science fiction and action have been pretty much inextricably intertwined since Star Wars debuted. Not that it was an immediate change, like Star Wars came along and then suddenly science fiction and action were synonymous, but before Star Wars, you can't deny that there was more variety to the sci-fi genre. There were still action-packed things. There was Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, the Mysterians, the vast majority of Godzilla movies. But at the same time, you also had stuff like Forbidden Planet and 2001: A Space Odyssey and what else? The original Star Trek, Destination Moon, more sci-fi stories that were slower paced, not necessarily in a rush to thrill the audience, and dwelt on more thought-provoking topics. Sometimes they felt more like they were adventures or even dramas sometimes, or mysteries. But after Star Wars, well, every studio wanted its own Star Wars, and that meant pumping up the action. So slower paced, more dramatic science fiction became fewer and fewer in numbers over the years, and then comic book movies basically drove the final nail into the coffin. So there was a concern that Foundation might fall into that trap as well. In fact, there was precedent for Asimov's work getting that sort of treatment. Look at I, Robot. I mean, already a loose adaptation, but then, of course, they had to throw in those thrilling action scenes because how else do you expect the audience to pay attention? They get easily bored, right? We don't, by the way, but that's the mindset, it seems. So that was one of my big concerns with Foundation. I think I've made that clear by now. But I'm surprised to say that they didn't go that direction. There is more action in the series than there is in the books, but there's also just more content because they're bringing in stuff from other areas. They're not just doing straight adaptations of the books. They're taking into account that Asimov also eventually brought the robot series into the books and stuff like that. So they're branching out a little, telling more of the story, and some of that does require there to be space battles. Some of it doesn't. Some of it is added just for the sake of action. But there are actually many episodes, and these are long episodes, mind you, that can go by with no action at all. It's mostly on the dramatic side, which was really refreshing, I gotta say. The trailers, if you watch them, they put more emphasis on the action. That stuff is in there, but it's not the focus. The focus, for the most part, is on the interactions, the political shenanigans going on, the intrigue, all of those things. Stuff that's more, I don't necessarily want to say down to earth, but it doesn't require you to just sort of turn your brain off and enjoy the big explosions. It's a series you definitely have to be paying attention to because there's a lot going on, and very little of it has to do with lasers and sword and gunfights and whatnot. There is also not a single bad performance in the whole thing. Everyone is bringing their A game here, and there are some real standouts, like Lee Pace as the Emperor. My word, like, he really was wasted in the role of Ronan the Conqueror in the MCU. This guy is astounding as the middle of the Imperial Trinity, if you will. It's difficult to understand if you hadn't seen it already. Basically, there are three different emperors, but they're all clones of each other, and they're clones of the first emperor. There's an older one who is in the process of stepping down. There's sort of a middle adult one who is the one actually in charge, and there's a younger one who is learning the ropes. But together they all basically rule. And Lee Pace plays the middle one, and because we see different generations of them, he's actually having to play different versions of that character, as are the ones playing the younger and older. And they all do well. I mean, like I said, there's not a single bad performance. No one really stands out as somehow not being on par with everyone else. Even the child actors, when they appear, there's none of that, oh, it's a child actor, so they're not really taking it seriously sort of thing. No, even they're bringing their A game. It's really impressive that the cast is this good. The special effects are also amazing. Like, Apple did not skimp on this at all. The ships are really well designed, the planetary environments are good. Quite a few of the environments, in fact, actually look practical. Or if they are all blue screen CGI things, then it's some of the best I've seen. I don't think they all are. I have a pretty good eye for telling when something is digital and something is real, even in this day and age. It all just looks amazing. And even when there's action, it isn't all necessarily the fast-paced, frantic, cutting to a new camera angle every half a second kind of action. Sometimes it's just like uh, first or second episode, I think. The Emperor sends a bunch of ships to basically bombard this one planet with nukes, and it's not a big action set, but you see the ships from orbit just launching these things down. It's a very harrowing shot. I certainly don't think anyone will argue that the series does not look amazing. It does look amazing. But this being an adaptation, there are changes that were made. And my philosophy on changing the source material is that change itself is, one, to be expected, and two, neither inherently good nor bad. I mean, you're adapting something from one medium to another. There are going to be changes, let's face it. There's a reason that superhero costumes in movies are never just spandex like they are in the comics, because most of the time it doesn't look as good. There's also a reason why certain scenes are put together when you're adapting a book to a film, because having those scenes apart kind of disrupts the flow of the storytelling style that is cinema. So that sort of thing is bound to happen. And Foundation makes some pretty significant changes. Not all of it. Like the trial of Harry Seldon, for example, the dialogue of that scene, taken almost word for word from the books. Very little alteration. But as far as the changes they do make, well, like I said, change is not inherently good or bad. You have to go case by case to see whether or not those changes actually are good or if they're bad. So let's get into that. One change is that certain concepts are introduced a little earlier than they are in the books. Like, for example, there's one character who is a robot. I will not say which one it is in case you haven't seen it and don't want things spoiled. But the idea of the Foundation series is that robots, initially, they weren't present at all. Eventually, Asimov incorporated his robot series as part of that universe, but it was like way, way in the past, and robots were no longer a thing, with very, very, very rare exceptions. And one character in particular, who is a robot, is present from the beginning, as opposed to being introduced later as the books did. Mention of the second Foundation is also made in this series when that wasn't readily apparent from the beginning of the first book. And the timeline, the part of why people were uncertain about whether or not Foundation could be adapted is because it takes place over generations. One part will take place in a particular span of time, and then in the next part, a century has passed, at least. And you would think, like, how do you do that with a series? Maybe you could do it with a movie if you stretched things out enough, like you could get a brand new cast for the sequel. But for a series, that seems tricky. They did find a way to do it, but they also found a way to have certain characters stick around for longer, mostly by way of things like cryogenics or AI or something, and have those characters maintained as a through line, as sort of the primary characters we follow, which, again, other than the character of Harry Seldon, isn't really part of the original books. But For this purpose, for the purpose of the series, it works well enough. One major change is that two characters from the books, who are elevated to the status of primary characters, well, in the book, those two characters are male, but in the series, they are female, which is a very, very big change. I mean, you don't just swap a character from male to female without making some major changes along the way. Now, the actors are also black, but that in and of itself is not necessarily a detail that was changed from the books, because the books don't actually specify race, at least not in those terms. Again, like, to clarify this, the Foundation is set so far ahead in the future that humanity, as it spread out across the galaxy and colonized new worlds and everything, eventually forgot that Earth even existed. And even if you could argue that certain people from certain parts of Earth settled on particular planets in particular systems, and it's their descendants who occupy them now, well, those people would not identify as Africans or Asians or Caucasians or what have you, because they have no concept of what Asia or Europe or those places even were. They would instead identify as the nationality of their planet. And Asimov doesn't really say what those nationalities were. So, for all we know, these characters were black in the original books, but they definitely were not women. That being said, it doesn't really bother me that they are. Like I said, that change brings with it some pretty major differences, and in fact, they also embody certain elements that, again, were not introduced in the books until much later, and also kind of serves to make them, and this is the word the show itself uses, special. But the way in which it's executed, I would not say is the sort of special female character that would drive audiences away. At least I don't think so. They're not the Mary Sue types. Yes, they are ahead of other people in some ways, but they're still prone to mistakes. They still make decisions that are questionable in nature, even in context. Like, it sort of acknowledges maybe this isn't the best idea. They don't have the automatic advantage in every scenario. So, I don't necessarily think that was a bad alteration in and of itself. Speaking of modern politics, though, it does feel every once in a while like the show wants to go in that direction, but always refrains from going completely that way, because there's probably a group of people who are saying we got to stick closer to the books. So, like, there'll be these weird moments where you will have a scene go with two characters, usually women, talking about how Harry Seldon lied and shame on him for lying to us or not telling us everything. And boy, was that a bad move on his part. And then in the very next scene, the narrator will come in and say, but they followed his plan anyway without any complaining, and it all worked out for the best. It's like, how did you get from there to there? It doesn't quite line up. There are moments like that throughout the series where, like I said, starts going in the direction of women telling off the old white guy, but then suddenly it veers back because that's what the book says. I hope those moments are fewer in season 2, because they do kind of disrupt the way the story goes. You can't have it be like everyone hates the character whose plan they're following, and then they follow the plan anyway without any explanation, and things work out, and it's like that last scene didn't even happen. That's just consistent writing. So for season 1, Foundation pulled it off. I am as surprised as anyone else. I don't necessarily think that it is better than the book, but I do think it serves the book well. Whether or not that will continue in season 2 remains to be seen, but I don't know. I think I might stick around with Apple and find out. And I'll probably be sticking around anyway because of the Godzilla series I mentioned all the way at the beginning, but for now, Foundation really does have me hooked. Here's hoping. I mean, anything can happen at this point. But those are just my thoughts. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off.
Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books: Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.